Welcome to Management 720. We're going to get started with Chapter 1, which is entitled Tools for Decision Making. Here are the Chapter 1 learning objectives, and we're going to go through each of them one by one. And I will just pause here for a moment and just talk about resources. So, of course, my lecture videos are a primary resource for understanding the content, but there are other ways, depending upon your learning style or timing of when you have time to be able to access resources. So, obviously, there's the textbook. You can always read the textbook. There are PowerPoints posted on D2L, and I've also just recently enabled the textbook videos that come with the textbook. Within each chapter, you can find that there's a resource called, I think they call them e-learning or e-videos or something like that. And I will just make a note that the textbook and the videos, because they're designed, and the PowerPoints, because they're designed by the publisher, I have typically found that the way they present information is to make every little piece of information as equally important as every other piece of information. And as we all know, that kind of tends to make textbooks a little bloated. So my primary purpose here is with my lecture videos is to draw out what I think are the important and crucial parts that you should know and understand, and of course that I will be testing on for the quizzes and exams, but also to give a little bit of context. I'll try and bring in some examples from industry, etc. Okay, on with the learning objectives. Number 1, what's the difference between managerial accounting and financial accounting? Well, you've already had a little bit of exposure to that between the financial accounting review quiz. I have pulled this table from another textbook, and I think it's a little bit better than the one our textbook has. Essentially, financial accounting is standardized. It's designed for external users such as creditors, investors, or the IRS. And managerial accounting is internal information, not designed for broadcast to outside. It's to help the managers internally make decisions. So whereas financial accounting is external, it needs to be standardized. It follows a standard called GAAP, and it is regularly published. The internal reports designed by managerial accounting are not necessarily complete. They could just focus on one piece of the business. They're done ad hoc when the company feels it's necessary. They're for a specific purpose. A lot of times there's more detail with the internal reports than the financial statements that are published for the outside world. And they don't have to be audited like the financial accounting statements have to be. A few other words. All the bits of information in the table are good. I'll also kind of throw out a couple of other qualifiers. Financial accounting is standardized, so that makes managerial accounting subjective. Financial accounting historical. Managerial accounting is future-oriented. The financial accounting reports are financial statements. The managerial reports are typically some sort of cost-benefit analysis. Financial accounting is focused on reporting. Managerial accounting is focused on decision-making. Financial accounting, for example, if you wanted to obtain financing, well, banks have to deal with all sorts of different types of customers, so their first stop is the financial statements. That is some sort of comparable information that they can make a decision on. Of course, they're going to want to know specifically about you and your business, but their first stop is the financial statements. Managerial accounting, if you wanted to have a customer satisfaction survey, well, each company determines customer satisfaction slightly different. Each industry is different in the products and services they sell, so a customer satisfaction report would be something that would be internally generated and not necessarily a comparable standardized statement like the financial statements. Learning Objective 2 has a kind of a long title, Strategic Cost Management, Long-Term Competitive Advantage. And if you look at our information from the textbook, it's looking at 3 different types of analysis: strategic position analysis, cost driver analysis, and value chain analysis. While it's important to know those definitions, definitely know those definitions, I want to pull out a slightly different take on what they're trying to show here in this chapter. The first thing is that what is another view of managerial accounting? So first we said it was decision making, and that's true, and I will stick with that. But a second, if we wanted to take an alternative view, is from a managerial accounting point of view, there are ways, how do you improve your business? Well, you can raise revenues. Well, that's more of a marketing discipline. Or you can cut cost or manage costs, I should say, manage costs. And that is a managerial accountant's typical area of work, is how to manage costs. And if you want to be able to manage costs, there's going to be many different ways you look at costs. So one of the more important things about managerial accounting, which is also called cost accounting, is to look at the different types of cost definitions. Previously, you may have seen definitions such as direct versus indirect costs, product versus period costs, materials or labors. And here we're going to talk a little bit about structural organizational activity and line versus staff. Now, not only knowing the definition of these costs is important, but understand the larger context. In other words, by understanding what costs the managerial accountant is choosing to define also tells you what is important to them. For example, when I asked undergrad class in their first accounting class, how does an accountant define business or the different types of business? And people will say, okay, maybe it's by product. Some companies are insurance companies, some currents are retailers. Maybe they'll define it by size. And I say, no, an accountant defines a business type by 3 definitions: service, merchandiser, and manufacturer. And that usually stumps students for a little bit until you understand how we divide this up is by the types of inventory. So our definition of business type is an inventory definition. A service company has no inventory. A merchandiser only has one type, finished goods. In other words, it buys things already made and packaged, and it sells them. There's just a markup. And a manufacturer has raw materials, work in process, and then finished goods. And so because in the accountant's mind, inventory is such an important part of how we do our accounting, that is in fact how we define different business types. And if you think about that, why would that be? Well, what is inventory? Inventory is something that we decide to sell. And in fact, you could say all assets are something that are used to generate revenue. Inventory, when we still own it, is called an asset. When we sell inventory, that same piece of inventory now has a different name. It's called an expense. It is specifically called a cost of goods sold. In other words, inventory and cost of goods sold are the same thing. It's just that inventory is pre-sale and cost of goods sold, the expense, is after sale. So from an accountant's point of view and from a businessman's point of view, we're hoping assets will become expenses, meaning we're hoping assets will be things that we sell, or in the terms of like long-term assets such as equipment, these assets will help us generate sales. And that's why when we have long-term assets such as factory buildings and equipment, we still expense them, and we call that depreciation, but that is still trying to help us understand our main purpose is to turn assets into expenses, assets to generate revenue. With Learning Objective 3, we're talking about 3 interrelated definitions. Missions, and they have this in the order of mission, goals, and strategies. But I actually think it should be mission, strategy, then goals. And so let's take, you have the definition from the textbook there in the image block, but let me give you sort of my take on them. Mission is aspirational, how you want to change the world or how you want to change the business, and it's defining some sort of end state. This is what we want things to look at. We want to feed the poor, or we want to whatever it may be. We want to be the lowest cost provider of goods or something like that. Strategy is, okay, if that's your mission, how are you going to do it? How are you going to fulfill this mission? What is the broad business avenue or the approach that you're going to do to get from here to there? And then goals. Goals are very quantifiable. If you can't, there's an old saying in business, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So goals should be measurable. They should be milestones helping you achieve your mission through the strategy you've chosen, and it should be quantified. So for example, your mission could be, I want to graduate from college. What is your strategy? Get enough sleep. What is a goal? I want to have a B average. Well, there's a lot of strategies to getting through college, but I just chose one simple, quick one. One of the other parts of this learning objective is strategic position analysis, basically meaning this goes into when we talk about mission, strategy, and goals. This is part of the strategy. So we said, well, what is the broad approach? Well, here are 3 common broad approaches to positioning your company to fulfilling your mission. It could be compete on cost leadership. It could be product differentiation, or it could be market niche. So if I said Walmart versus Target, well, both of them sort of compete on cost, but I would say Walmart positions itself as the lowest cost alternative, while Target differentiates itself a little bit by seeming to have, if you look at the commercials, right? If you look at the commercials have a lot of color in them. They're looking to be sort of a slightly higher quality version of Walmart. And so if you're not a complete if you're a customer not completely focused on lowest cost, but low cost with quality, that would be a differentiation. There are other ways to differentiate your product or service, and I'll just mention I put service here, and if in the future I only put the word product, just think of product as product or service, because product, I think services can be quote unquote products, but here typically products they think of as physical products. So LG phones, and of course LG has dropped out of the smartphone race. You can see from this graphic here that Samsung is the biggest supplier of smartphones. Number 2 is Apple. Then look at all of these from China: Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, Realme, Lenovo. Lenovo is, if you don't know, Lenovo is the PC, the personal computer division of IBM. IBM had a personal computer division called Lenovo, or it was called IBM, and then they sold it to China, and China renamed it Lenovo. So Lenovo is actually a former IBM unit. LG, now they've dropped out, so Techno. So you basically have Samsung and Apple at the top, and then a bunch of Chinese brands. Now you notice, I don't think most of these, maybe some Huawei or some Xiaomi, are sold outside of China, but I would imagine most of those are sold solely within China or within the Asian region. Whereas in Europe and the Americas, I would say Samsung and Apple are the primary ones. Now, one differentiation here is one is Android and one is Apple OS, and that could be a differentiation. I would also say that Apple phones typically are higher priced. It also is not only differentiation about what type of operating system they use, what ecosystem they are in, because you have the Android and Google markets for those things, and Apple has its own app markets. But I would say Apple positions itself as a higher quality or maybe higher priced alternative. If we look at a couple of other types of companies, Honda versus BMW. BMW is more of a luxury brand. Honda is more of a consumer price conscious brand, but Honda also sells itself, I'd say both of them, but maybe to a bigger degree. Honda sells itself as a reliable, that from a maintenance standpoint, very reliable. And that may not be something that BMW tries to sell itself on. Tesla versus Subaru. Now, you wouldn't think that these two would be comparable, but they're comparable in this way. They're both niche markets. Subaru is a very unique kind of vehicle. It still tries to be mass commercial, but I would say the market for Subaru is quite particular. It's sort of a budget outdoor vehicle, which is not what a lot of other companies, in other words, not a lot of other companies compete in the Subaru space. And same with Tesla, although there are more people trying to compete in the EV, the electric vehicle space. So both of these are somewhat niche products. I've just reposted here the cost leadership, product differentiation, market niche. These are the three areas. Let's take one other industry, the insurance industry. Now, do they compete on cost leadership? They're all trying to have as cheap prices as possible. Is insurance, auto and home insurance really that different? Is there a niche? So here's a very generic product. So how do they go about finding their business approach? Well, what I found is they have done none of these three. They're not really cost leadership. They're not very product differentiated because they all sell auto and home insurance, nor are they niche. They're more focused on marketing differentiation. They each have a different spokesperson, a jingle, and a tagline. In other words, they're just trying to form some bond with the customer. And it's really this marketing approach for differentiation that changes. And I've just listed a bunch of them here. Progressive, Flo with her white apron. They don't really have a tagline. They just say bundle home and auto at least a dozen times each ad. State Farm with Jake, like a good neighbor. The General with Shaquille O'Neal, get the General. Farmers, J.K. Simmons. They don't use this tagline as much, but they used to use it quite a bit. We know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. Nationwide, well, they used to have a spokesman called Dennis Haysbert, who was quite, I don't want to say, he was a quite popular character actor maybe 10, 15 years ago. He was, if you've ever watched the TV series 24, he was the president in the early seasons. And it's Nationwide is on your side. So they're kind of more focused on their jingle and tagline. Geico, the Gecko, okay, 15 minutes could save you 15%. Allstate, I kind of find these a little funny. The guy that's always getting beaten up, mayhem, you're in good hands. USAA, Gronk, I don't even know what their tagline is or jingle, but they're kind of new to the competition. And then the one that I dislike the most, I don't want to say hate. I'll say it. I hate the most is Liberty Mutual, Emu, Limo, and Doug. And they did Liberty. Now, between Geico and Liberty Mutual, I think that their differentiation is on annoyance factor. In other words, there's a lot of pleasant commercials out there that you forget as soon as you see them. But which commercials are you going to remember? You're going to remember the ones that are slightly annoying. So those slightly dad joke funny Geico commercials or Emu, Limo, and Doug, they're just kind of annoying. But I think that that's their strategy. Their differentiation is on the type of annoyance that they can implant in your mind so that if someone says, an insurance company, I might struggle to remember some of these others, but I'll definitely remember the couple of commercials that annoy me. And there are other types of things where companies don't compete on cost leadership or differentiation. Think about all the cartoon characters for cereal. Yes, they probably taste a little different. You may have a taste for different cereals. It used to be that there was some sort of, I don't want to say analogy, but some sort of empathy. It used to be Michelin tires used to have in all of their tire commercials a baby in the middle of a Michelin tire. And you think, well, what does a baby have to do with Michelin tires? Well, it creates some sort of empathetic bond, right? It's a little surreptitious. So I think that's why they went away from it, that, it has nothing to do with their product. They're just trying to create some sort of maybe maternal bond with it. And you don't see this as much anymore. Funny enough, when I go over to overseas markets, they still use a lot of endorsements, famous athletes or famous singers or other famous people. But it used to be, 20, 30 years ago that endorsements were a very big part of advertising. In other words, they didn't talk anything about how they were differentiated. They just want you to identify their product with some famous athlete. And of course, that's can be problematic these days. And one of the earliest ones that I remember when I was young, there was Steve Garvey. He was a very ruggedly handsome first baseman for the Dodgers, and he always promoted Aqua Velva, which is an aftershave. In fact, they used to say, "Are you an Aqua Velva man?" And of course, you're thinking, "Am I like Steve Garvey?" Well, I'm not like Steve Garvey, but I wish I was when I was young. Another part of Learning Objective 3 is the idea of planning, organizing, and controlling. So we've already talked about mission goals and strategies, and this is a slightly different take on it. This is on how you go about doing some of these things. Planning is setting the milestones and the budgets to reach the goal as defined by strategy. So it sits somewhere between strategy and goal. Organizing. So if planning is setting up how you're going to do it, organizing is actually saying, if this is our plan, this is what we want to do, these are the milestones, this is the budget. Are my assets set up to actually to work well with my plan? Meaning, okay, this is what I want to achieve. Are my human resources and are my physical assets actually arranged correctly to match up with the plan? And lastly, while planning and organizing are kind of done prior to actually running the business or running the business year or the production year, during business time, you control, or the controlling aspect is assuring that the plan and the organization is working, that there's no deviation or variance from the plan, and basically trying to see that you're effectively and efficiently reaching your goals. And so from the organizing, or at least the organizing human resource part of it, here's another view of some common looks at how companies organize themselves. So in the top one, which is from our textbook, this is a company that has, instead of a CEO, it has a president, has VP of purchasing, advertising, operations, and you notice the treasurer controller report to the president. The bottom one from a different textbook shows that you have a stockholders who elect the board of directors, who hires the CEO. And then this is more of a typical regular corporation type of business. You have vice president, these various vice presidents, and the treasurer and controller report to the CFO. Now, again, like I was just saying with how does an accountant define a business? It's by the type of inventory it has. You can also understand what is important to a corporation or to a company by how it organizes its main VPs or its main divisions. So, for example, these two images here are very common ones, but companies can organize in different ways. So, for example, Nike wouldn't have a VP of marketing, this, that, and the other. It may, but it organizes more on silos of footwear, clothing, equipment, golf, although golf is gone now. And that's because what is important to Nike, or what do they think are their differentiates them from other companies? And that's their product design, meaning they think their people and processes for the product design of footwear are going to be vastly different, but equally important for the product designers for clothing versus the product designers for equipment. In other words, there's no crossover there, right? Those product designs and those manufacturing and those advertising silos should be separate. So you would have your company divided up that way. Another one is, for example, if you're a large retail chain, you may be thinking more upon distribution regions, meaning you may have a production facility in various parts of the country, or you may be having main distribution centers in various parts of the countries. So running your business, or how you organized your corporate structure, is based upon the distribution regions. So it may be Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, that sort of thing, or maybe by country. But the idea is that the logistics is the key part of running the business. So how you divide up underneath your CEO, how you divide up your operations and maybe your other departments is based upon this distribution or this production facility supplies all of the West Coast, this one supplies all of the Southeast, and this one a third one supplies all the Northeast. So you may separate your company in those areas. So in other words, once again, looking at either how they ask the questions for cost or how they divide up their company tells you what's important for them or how they differentiate themselves from other companies. For learning objective 4, we're looking at the business environment. And specifically, we're saying, how does a company compete? Well, it depends upon who else is in your business environment, who else is your competition. So you can compete on price or cost, and those are related but not exactly the same. Price presumes that there's related competition, that there's people in your segment. Think about when you're talking about mid-sized trucks, or you're talking about different types of retail goods, Target versus Walmart. There's going to be some sort of competition price because they're selling relatively, if not the same good. Walmart and Target might sell the exact same thing, whereas truck companies might sell a truck that is essentially, the definition is the same by company, but they're differentiating on their brand, but they're competing on price. So compete on price. Price presumes there's related competition. If you're talking about cost, what you're talking about is perhaps you're hopeful that you're supplying the quality needed, but maybe no more. So cost involves a quality trade-off. In other words, reducing cost. Are you actually undersupplying or oversupplying quality that the customer needs or doesn't need? And the difference between price and cost, so the difference between the competition and the quality required, is your margin or your profitability. So competing in a price cost environment is very difficult, and typically you want economies of scale. So that therefore you see a lot of companies that compete on price typically are very large companies, whereas companies that compete on quality can be a little smaller and a little more defined, because essentially when you compete on quality, you're allowing the customer's need to outweigh cost. And so sometimes, obviously there's the luxury goods markets, but there's a lot of markets that the quality is more important, and therefore it determines how long between releases of a product, or how the segments are a little bit different. This is not quite a quality definition, but I remember the famous antiperspirant story that up until, the early 1900s, people didn't feel like they needed deodorant or antiperspirant. They just didn't feel it was necessary. So rather than compete on price or cost or compete on the quality, they had to compete on the idea that it was actually even needed. And so this was, again, I keep going back to advertising and marketing because I find it fascinating sometimes how marketing kind of short circuits the regular accounting and business world. That there was a marketing campaign where it convinced people that it was antisocial to smell bad. And then all of a sudden people started saying, well, I better buy antiperspirant, because up to that point, when you didn't put out there the idea that smelling bad, even if you weren't smelling bad, but with the concept that you could be perceived as smelling bad. And so I've listed here an interesting article about how advertiser convinced Americans they smell bad for the purpose, they don't say it here, but for the purpose of selling deodorant. Also, when you compete on quality, you're also competing upon scarcity. So a lot of times companies will intentionally make their goods scarce. For example, diamonds. There's a lot of diamonds that have been mined, but the main diamond companies, I don't want to say hoard, but they have tucked away in vaults a ton of diamonds so that they only release X amount of diamonds each year to maintain scarcity and therefore to maintain price. Another one is in the luxury goods market. For those of you who know what a Birkin bag is, and I imagine some of us do and some of us don't, a Birkin bag is an Hermes. It's a luxury goods provider. It's I don't want to say just a handbag. Maybe that's insulting. It is a handbag, a luxury goods handbag that is supposed to be, sometimes I've heard, up to a 6-year wait list to get this thing. And other people have given advice on how to short circuit the wait list. What you need to do is go and form a relationship with the authorized dealer. You need to go in and start buying other goods from Hermes, like a scarf or something else, and slowly build up a reputation for being a good customer. And then perhaps you can kind of get pushed up the wait list. But still, you can't just walk in and buy a Birkin bag. So now that's kind of the extreme, of course, but that's definitely competing on quality, and even the extreme form of quality is scarcity. Learning objective 5 deals with ethical dilemmas, and while I'm going to be kind of short and brief with this topic, it's not because I don't believe in it. In fact, professional ethics is one of my research areas. It's just that this is a very involved topic, and typically they give it short shrift in textbooks. And so I'm not really going to test too much on this, because I feel like either you do an extensive dive or you just don't. In other words, scratching the surface isn't really that worth it. But I will give you a couple of takeaways here. So a lot of times they're only thinking about a written code of ethics. But in fact, I have found in my research and a lot of things that it's not only just written down what is the right and wrong thing to do, but there needs to be sort of a word of mouth and an ethical environment. And what I found is that in order to have an ethical workplace, it comes down to first of all, do what the rules say in the code of ethics and what senior management say. Do those align? And not only do those two things align, but do those two things align with how they actually reward employees? In other words, it's nice to say do the right thing, but if you reward employees for doing the wrong thing, it doesn't matter what the rules say and what management says. If you reward employees for doing the wrong thing, then still you won't have an ethical environment. And here's an example, Wells Fargo. This is an example that's, it was pretty common, pretty well known maybe 5 years ago, but it's starting to slip out of memory. Wells Fargo, about 7 years ago, or maybe somewhere in there, were found guilty of creating over 1 million fake accounts by middle and lower managers to reach the goal. The goal at Wells Fargo internally, they said, was what we want to do is expand our business by increasing the number of products that each of our customers use. In other words, if they have a banking account, have them open a mutual fund account, or have them open a money market account, or have them open a savings account, or any of those types of things. In other words, by each account that a customer opens, the idea is that Wells Fargo will have a little bit more management fees. Well, customers weren't opening more accounts, but while Wells Fargo management says we need to do the right thing, they kind of looked the other way when middle managers started opening fake accounts. Now, there wasn't any money in that. For example, if a person had a credit card account and a checking account, maybe they had opened them a money market account. And while they didn't actually move any of the customers' money, they did charge them a few dollars of extra of fees. Now, whether or not those fees were actually material or actually added to the bottom line, it allowed middle managers to get promoted because they said, well, I opened X amount of new accounts, and they were rewarded that way. And you've got to know, and it's been sort of, I don't want to say proven, but it's highly indicative that senior management, you can't do this for 5 or 6 years for which they were doing it, and senior management not know what is actually going on. If it was just 1 year or one department or something like that, maybe you can get away with saying, oh, we didn't know. But this was extensive and pervasive throughout Wells Fargo, and that's why they were punished by the SEC. Another topic is corporate governance. And when we talk about governance, we're really talking about 3 things. Efficient management must be able to manage efficiently and effectively their operations. They must also be able to submit transparent reporting. In other words, the financial statements must be good, and they must be in keeping with any legal regulations. Certain industries have a lot of regulations. Think about the pharmaceutical industry, or think about the hospital industry. Lots of different industries, or banking regulations. So corporate governance is first and foremost these things: operations, financial reporting, and regulations. But there are other things, policies, the internal controls to make sure fraud isn't happening. And in addition to this, the code of ethics, what we talked about earlier, the ethical framework also goes into corporate governance. The last learning objective has to do with cost drivers. In other words, if we are trying to measure some sort of cost, what is the business activity or what is the business thing that is driving those costs, pushing it forward? So just to this is another set of 3 definitions. I'll just mention, and right underneath the image block, I have the other things we've already talked about. We've talked about mission, strategy, and goals. We've also talked about planning, organizing, and controlling. And now we're going to talk about structural, organizational, and activity cost drivers. And they all interrelate to some degree. There's very rarely is there sort of just a one-to-one comparison. But this goes back to when I was saying that managerial accounting looks at costs from many different viewpoints. And so this is just another way to slice and dice costs and activities within the organization. So structural is the form and scope of operations. For example, size of stores, location of stores, what's the technology employed? In other words, sort of the big picture, how you're going to approach it. It could be sitting somewhere between strategy from the mission, strategy, and goals, and the planning and organizing from the second list. Now, I just mentioned when I was in New Zealand running stores there, we had a joint venture partner for a while, which was a large local clothing store, and they were going to help us get into the different malls around New Zealand. Now, you would think, oh, there might be competition. Why would we have them as a JV partner if we're both trying to go into the same malls? Well, the truth was it was great because they were a very well-known brand and had a very good relationship with the malls, whereas GNC, going into the vitamin people, going into New Zealand, were not a very well-known brand and therefore would have no pull with the mall management companies. But by saying we were partnered with this clothing company, they would listen to us. And the good thing is that the format and the size of a clothing store was much bigger than the size of a vitamin store. So we weren't in actual competition. We weren't going for the same storefront. The clothing stores were maybe taking a more prominent, larger store area within the mall, and we could go for the smaller ones. And so by being able to kind of not have to overlap as far as our store size, it worked out pretty well as a joint venture partner. Organizationally, this is a lot of maybe supply chain issues or operational issues about how you're going to actually implement your strategy. So number or location of suppliers. What is the factory layout? Are you going for are you trying to be effective and efficient? What is the type of customer experience? Think about Apple stores. They have a very different type of customer experience than other types of stores that you go into. And I mentioned here Roughwear Consulting. I did some consulting for a dog, for a high-performance dog outerwear company, rough as in, dog barking, Roughwear. And they were asking me, should they be conducting business in Europe, and could they open a distribution center in Europe? And I actually flipped the question on its head, and I said, let's look at your supply chain. You are sourcing a bunch of your products in Asia, and you're sourcing them all over Asia. In other words, you may have leashes with this company in this country, and you may be having, dog jackets with another company in another country. Now, because you have enough volume in the U.S., you can fill a container in Asia and ship it over to the U.S. and do it from your distribution facility here. Now, they were thinking of supplying a distribution facility in Europe from their distribution facility in the U.S. And I said, really, the best way you want to do from a cost point of view is supply a European distribution facility from directly from Asia. I said, but the problem is you have spread out your suppliers too wide, that because Europe initially will be smaller volume, you won't be able to fill containers. And so that you'll be paying a much higher shipping cost. What you need to do, and this would benefit your U.S. operations, is maybe consolidate some of those suppliers within the same company or at least within the same country, so you can have a single distribution spot. That way you would, first of all, have lower costs to your U.S. market, but you could actually see where is going to be, what is the volume necessary to actually fill a container on a monthly basis. And that's the point of sales in which you can open a distribution facility in Europe. And that was an organizational cost driver. Activity cost drivers, those are specific activities or specific work to run the operations, serve customers. And these are more kind of day-to-day operations. How often do you order from suppliers? What's the level of inventory I'm going to keep? What type of manufacturing am I going to run? Am I going to run lean manufacturing or some more bespoke manufacturing? What type of employee training am I going to be doing? What is the status and purpose of my packing, shipping, and delivery? Does that contribute to customer satisfaction if I do it one way versus another? And those are the activity cost drivers. That's all of the learning objectives. I'll just mention there are some homework problems on line versus staff, but they're not very defined in the textbook. So let me give you a little bit of extra explanation as far as the homework for the question or two on line versus staff. When they're asking you to identify is this position or this department a line position or a staff position, what they're meaning is a line position is some department or some title that faces the customer or deals with facing the customer, or alternatively is involved in the primary business activity to service customers. So a plant manager, well, they're not directly facing the customer, but they're making the product that you sell to the customer. So that is a primary business activity. A store manager is selling to customers. If they're asking about, in the particular question, they're saying the home furnishings department. Well, those are employees in a retail department that faces the customer. Now, what are staff? Anything that's internal support. In other words, they don't deal with the customers and they don't deal with the direct primary business activity. They're not making the product. They're doing something else. Payroll, HR, advertising, accounting, all of these sort of activities are staff or internal support type of activities. Okay, well, that finishes up chapter 1. If you have any questions about homework or information within the video, please let me know. And just remember the other resources you have. You have the PowerPoints, and you have the textbook, and you have the videos, the textbook videos that are posted on the My Business Course software. Thank you.